I'm not going to try and do the words because I always screw it up.
Walked in to find you here with that sad look upon your face. Should have changed that stupid lock. I should have made you leave your key if I'd known. But
Welcome to karaoke with me and Jan.
I grew up in industrial metal clubs.
Singing that, okay, yeah, that's fine.
Actually, it would make a really good metal cover.
So yeah, the action RPG is coming along, and
Actively in development. Yeah.
I think next time we come around, I do want to revisit the idea of texturing and just show you guys why we're not going with the main texturing route. But I want to play it with a few more things first to see how it comes out.
So on our original test, we thought, well, is this going to be more performant to bake in a height map and a normal map? And you can absolutely do that. But the problem we've got is that these are quite large objects. We
Yep.
didn't want to use very large textures. And Mikey worked out that we were getting like 1 pixel per inch.
1.3 pixels per inch in
Which
real
is
world
not
scale.
great. Like when you saw it in game,
Yeah.
the floors suddenly became very blurry.
Yeah, a bit blurry and jagged. Now you can turn on. So I baked out a couple of different maps. I baked out the diffuse map. I baked out an ambient occlusion map, so we could fake shadows and all that lot. I also baked out a normal map and then a displacement map. And for the displacement, I made sure it was 16-bit, so at least we've got a bit more. It doesn't end up being so steppy. And then in Godot, you can turn up the layers, so I turned up those maximum. And we haven't done a performance test with it yet, but basically at a 124, so a 1K texture for a 20-meter room, looks okay as long as you don't look at it. So I then shrunk it down. So I under the UV options, you can say, right, tile it 2x2. So that's the equivalent of a 2K texture. And it looked better. And then I did it again. And obviously the texture's getting smaller and smaller and then repeating. So it's not quite the same. It's not the same aesthetic. And by the time we reached 4K, it was looking pretty good. And one of the questions is, does it look good enough with the parallax also being enabled? So we've got real depth there. Is that more performant than just the floor we're going for in the first case? Because it's a lot of extra work to bake out all the extra textures.
Yes.
So the question is, can we just get away with geometry?
We could also be using that we're not using with textures. Like there's a new decal system. There's the detail layer where you can put a whole new layer of texturing on top of stuff.
Yeah.
And then you can switch those out to give you some more variations. But the problem is our original design aesthetic isn't that. We had a very flat, cartoonish, angular, lots of pentagons. That was the look of the original prototype.
So one of the things that I do want to play with is when we have a wall, rather than having quite flat faces and angular faces, is having more faces and more jaggedness, but actually with a normal map. So you can have a blob with a normal map on it, and it actually looks like a rocky surface.
For those people who don't know what a normal map is, Michael, what's a normal map?
A normal map is a type of bump map. I'm glad you asked. What is a bump map? Well, there are two types. There's a displacement map or a height map, and there's a direction map. Now, you could have a normal map which shows the direction of light, but not its displacement. So you can have a surface, let's see if I can get sighted on, that's like this, and another surface that's lower down, but because their normals both point that way, they will look the same on a normal map. But on a height map, this one will look a lighter color than this one because this one's higher up than this one.
So to make that even more simplified,
it makes things
if you imagine you've got your flat surface, right? The way you would show where the light is going is you draw the normal, the perpendicular, and the light hits there, and then whatever that angle is must be the same on the other side. But if there's a slight unevenness, then that normal is in a different place. With a normal map, you can have a flat surface and pretend that it's bumpy. So you say, at this point, the normal is in this direction, so angle the light that way.
So they're a great optimization technique if you've got lots of geometry. Because we do have quite a bit of geometry in some of our meshes. However, they're not detailed at all in terms of their bumpiness. They don't have scratches in them, and they don't have extra bits like that. And that's potentially something we can add whilst keeping the same aesthetic. We could potentially put scratches that are very sharp. But what we've discovered is for the whole room scale, that scratch would look very jagged and actually doesn't look very nice because of the size of texture.
These pieces weren't designed with that in mind. So to add them in now looks weird. So then the question became, do we now go back a few steps and think, okay, we're now texturing everything? Because you can't texture just the floor, right? It's going to look weird.
Yeah,
So now we have to
we
texture the
tried it.
wall,
It looks weird.
pillars, and everything else. Like, otherwise, you've got two different aesthetics happening in your game. Or do we just go back and say, we're not going to be using normal maps? We're
Mm.
going to just use geometry.
I still think we're going to lean towards geometry, and ultimately, one of the things, if you were doing this in your own project, to extrapolate it out even further, it would depend on the platform that you're actually trying to go for. So, if you required a room and you needed to put a single texture on it, if you go for a 4K texture, that it looks much better than a 1K texture. But does the platform that you're trying to deploy to support 4K textures? It would look even better with an 8K texture, sure. If you're deploying it to people who have got lots of VRAM in their game in order to have it in there, you
And don't forget, you don't just have the one. If you've got like
yeah,
every object has an 8K texture, you're in real trouble.
yeah, you're chewing up VRAM. And 8K doesn't sound that much more, but for every time you double that, you're quadrupling the size, subject to some optimizations, but you're quadrupling the size of the image. So literally a 1 megabyte, let's say 1K texture, which actually be quite large, would end up being, what would it be, 2 at 2 for it would follow along with that, wouldn't it? In terms of the
Where'd
resolution
you get the
increase.
quadrupling?
Well, if you go from
Right.
1024 by
You said
1024.
quadruple in one sense, then you just doubled it in the other one. I'm confused.
Yeah, it
I'm
was
not a
me
math
getting
teacher.
confused with myself. So if you've got
Yeah.
a 1 megabyte texture, that's 1K, and you have a 2K, it will be 4 megabytes in size,
Right.
subject to some optimizations and everything else. But linearly, it gets very big very quickly. And I don't know what the number is. Someone
Well, we
calculate it and
discovered
put it
this
in
when we
chat.
were playing with the Mag Racer prototype a couple of years back, where we just made every texture 2K texture. Um,
No,
every
there
texture of
were
the game,
4K textures in there because
4K textures.
I
I'm sorry.
baked some in
Every
without
building,
paying
every ship,
attention.
every prop, and then we ran it, and the frame rate was through the floor. Like it was just too small or too low, because we hammered the VRAM.
Okay, so a 1 megabyte 1K texture at 8K is 64 megabytes.
Right.
So it really gets big really quickly. And it wouldn't take long with multiple things to actually get to a point where that's too much on screen. Now, one of the ways of looking at it is when you're creating the texel density is what's called when you put a texture on that on the screen itself. If you're viewing it on a 4K screen and you go really really close and you zoom in, then you might benefit from something like a 16K texture. But if that particular object is only ever seen from a view distance that fills up half the screen, then
I mean,
you're
there's a few
wasting
things like that, right?
stuff.
There's good UV mapping. Like,
Yep.
where's the attention going to be? There's not having geometry where no one's going to see it because that's things that are going to be textured.
Oh, that was a good one. We'll get put a pin in that. We'll come back to texture, not texture, but mesh is where you can't see it. Carry on.
That was it. That was the whole
Cool.
thing.
Now moving on to. So one of the other things that we discovered is when we're putting all these procedural models together, is how procedural do we want to make things? What's our smallest quantity of
Right.
object? Because the way that we're structuring it is we could have building in Blender, you could just have the floor, the walls all in situ to begin with. But we don't want that because we want to be able to swap out floors, we want to be able to swap out walls, we want to be able to swap out door frames, etc. So,
We had a whole long, almost debate about this
yeah,
because
it was
I was arguing so for the assets you get with the course or for the extra assets you
yeah,
can buy, um, it'd be like, okay, here's this wall, here's a variation of this wall, here's a variation of this wall, like the corner,
yeah,
you could drop it in on this floor, here's your piece. And Mikey was saying, no, 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 no. Here's this wall, here's this pillar, here's these arches, here's this floor, here's this running board,
yeah.
like all these extra pieces, so that if you want to swap them out, you can. And my argument was, but that leads us with a whole bunch of unseen geometry.
So
And
there's
Mikey's
a
like, yes, but it allows a lot more flexibility.
yes. So you've got this trade off, and one of the things that we learned by going through the entire process is that if you're damned if you optimize too early, you then can't edit your models as easily.